And if the electrons work tonight, I'm going to share screen. And can somebody give me a thumbs up or so if you're indeed seeing my screen?
Yep, it's good, kiddo.
Okay. So having visited with some of you, I think some of you can tell the same story that I'm going to tell. This is the legend of General Pete, Pastor Peter Muhlenberg, depicted as you see on the screen, wearing a black robe. And I'm going to ask Jim Nisley later on to talk a little bit about the robe with the military uniform underneath. And so this is the way Pete is always portrayed. This is a statue at Muhlenberg College, and every student at Muhlenberg, I think at some point in their life, has been photographed next to the statue of General Pete. Again, depicted with the clergy robe over his shoulder and the military uniform underneath. And so let me get straight away to exactly what this story is. The date is January 21st, 1776. The location is Woodstock, Virginia, on the territory of the Virginia Synod. The topic is the farewell sermon at his Lutheran Church of Pastor John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. His text for the evening is the 3rd chapter of Ecclesiastes. We don't usually spend a whole lot of time in the book of Ecclesiastes in the common lectionary, but this is one thing that you probably know. If you didn't read it in the Bible, most of us, I think, are old enough to remember the Bird's version of Turn, 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 which you're welcome to hum along as we go. A time for this, a time for that. I think you know how the song goes. And again, you see another piece of art of General Pete. This is his statue in the US Capitol. Again, portrayed with the robe over top the military uniform. So Pastor Muhlenberg was an active colonial. He was a member of the Committee on Safety in Woodstock and a member of the House of Burgesses in Virginia. And so even though he was a pastor, he was quite a political figure in his community, highly respected, especially among the German community in Shenandoah County at the time, but most definitely a leader and a bit of a firebrand. And he gave this very impassioned sermon where he read all the pieces from Ecclesiastes, but then he added, and there is a time to preach and a time to fight, and the time to fight is now. Whereupon he threw off the robe, revealing the military uniform underneath, pronounced that there would be no recessional hymn. Instead, there was a drum beat with perhaps some fife associated with it, marched to the end of the sanctuary, and the legend goes that 300 men joined the colonial army that day in response to his sermon. Now, I will tell you at Muhlenberg College, back in the day of beanies and sweaters with letters on them and such, it was the privilege of any upper class student who encountered a freshman, a first-year student on the path, to inquire of the student what time it was. And the proper answer was not 3:45 or whatever time it was. The proper response for the freshman was to assume the position of General Pete and pronounce that it was a time to preach and a time to fight. The time to fight is now. And if they didn't give that answer, they were in trouble. Thus, the legend was taught to me during first-year orientation by Professor Ed Baldridge, who was quite the storyteller in his own right. This statue is in the courthouse at Shenandoah County. It's one of two that's in the courthouse, because the first one that was put up was not approved by the Daughters of the American Revolution, who insisted on putting up a second that they did approve of. So there are two statues of Peter Muhlenberg in the courthouse. Another photo with General Pete. This is much older. Some men in military uniform. This comes from the late 40s. And the question I'll throw out there is, did this event, this legend that has been told over the years, really happen? It makes for good theater. It makes for great story. But the probability that it actually happened, and that it actually happened according to the way it's told, is probably pretty low. There's been a number of scholarly reviews of the legend, and here's the sorts of things that they conclude. First off, the question of the date. January 21st, 1776. If you go on the website for Emmanuel Lutheran in Woodstock, they will give you January 23rd, 1776, which is a Tuesday. Emmanuel Episcopal in Woodstock will tell you it happened in 1775. Other accounts will put the date further toward March, because the records from Beckford Parish, which is the Episcopal parish at the time, show that Pastor Muhlenberg was indeed still marrying people and still baptizing people into March of 1776. So he probably didn't give his farewell sermon in January. The legend of the 300 men, the records show that the maximum number of men that ever served from Dunmore County, which is what's now Shenandoah County, was 140. So the 300 is a bit of an exaggeration. And what we know of Peter Muhlenberg's whereabouts is that there was a meeting going on in Williamsburg of the House of Burgesses that led out on Saturday, the 20th. And we know he was there. He is recorded in the minutes early in the week. We don't know when he left. He didn't speak in the last few days so that he'd be recorded, but he's not shown in the minutes as being absent either. So in 1776, you would not have been able to get from Williamsburg to Woodstock overnight. In fact, given Washington, D.C. traffic, it's tough to do it now. Historians will actually try to look for original record. And one of the reasons that the legend is questioned is that there are no contemporaneous reports of this happening whatsoever. The first account is written in a biography of Peter Muhlenberg, done by his nephew Henry in 1849, some 75 years later. And this biography has the words and all that's there. There is mention in a journal from Dr. James Thacker, published in 1823. He was sitting around a campfire in 1778, 2 years later, with about 40 officers who were telling stories, and heard a story about a fiery sermon from Muhlenberg, and he recorded it in his journal, but he has no details and no words that go with it. So unfortunately for people who like to dress up as Peter Muhlenberg, for people who are members of either of the Emmanuels in Woodstock, the likelihood of our legend being true in the way that it's told, as I say, is pretty slim. It does not, however, mean that Peter wasn't an interesting character. So let me talk a little bit about Peter Muhlenberg generally, going way back to his childhood. The real John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg is the oldest son of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, the great-grandfather of all Lutheranism in the United States, indeed in the colonies before the United States. Young Pete was a rebellious little kid. He was far more interested in hunting and fishing than he was in schoolwork. But nonetheless, his father sent him to Germany to the preparatory school at Halle. Henry Muhlenberg had come from Halle, sent to the colonies there. And he sent Pete and his two brothers off to be schooled. Pete got in trouble. There are accounts that say he was dismissed from the school. There are accounts that say he ran away from the school. Perhaps the most likely is that he ran away the night before he was about to be dismissed. Whatever it is, we know that he left the school at Halle. He kicked around the town and joined up with a band of dragoons, a military unit in town. And that was his first experience with military service. And given his personality, his buddies in this band of dragoons nicknamed him Teufel Pete. If you know any German, you know that Teufel is devil. So this is Devilish Pete, is our guy. Eventually, he's brought back to the US. He did complete his formal education at the Academy in Philadelphia. That's now the University of Pennsylvania. And he was ordained as a Lutheran pastor, and his first congregation is in Bedminster, New Jersey, a little town that nobody's ever heard of until we now learn that the former guy spends his summers there at his golf course. But that was Pete's first congregation. He moved to Woodstock, however, to preach and carry on clergy duties in Virginia required you to be Anglican. Virginia, I find interesting, prides itself on the statute of religious freedom. You can believe what you want to believe, but if you're going to preach in Virginia in the 18th century, you had to be Church of England. And so even though he'd already had a Lutheran congregation, he needed to be ordained in Church of England. And the way you get ordained in the Church of England in the 18th century is you get sent to England. And off he went, spent some time there, was reviewed and ordained. And this explains why both Emmanuel Episcopal Church in Shenandoah, in Woodstock, and Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Woodstock both claim their origin through the church of Peter Muhlenberg. I think they're differentiated. I have my research correct. Emmanuel Lutheran has one M in Emmanuel, and Emmanuel Episcopal has two M's in Emmanuel. Emmanuel Episcopal in Woodstock, if you were to go there, they will show you the very altar linens that were on the altar the day that Pete did his thing, and show you the communion ware that was in use at that time. And if you go to Philadelphia Seminary, they will have the very robe that was used by Pete on that day. And there's some good history to that robe. What I know of that history is that it has been verified to be an 18th century clergy robe. There's some good documentation that it was passed down from the Muhlenberg family to a family, I believe, named Henkel, who donated it to the seminary at Philadelphia. And Jim Nisley, if you want to interject here, you know more about this robe than probably any living person. So what can you tell us?
Well, I had the honor of leading the effort in 2011 to restore that robe, because when it was donated out of our church in Newmarket Reformation by the Henkel family, they did it on the 200th anniversary of Heinrich Muhlenberg's birth. It was, as you said, it was on display. The seminary, Mount Airy, has been its traditional name through the years, and my father was a graduate there. It was deteriorating, so they took it off a display. And so in 2011, some of you remember we had a display that we took around the synod from Halle, the university, and we raised enough funds. The biggest fundraiser was a service there at Emmanuel Lutheran Woodstock. And so the robe has been restored, and it is now in Philadelphia at the preservationist office. They, because of COVID, didn't quickly transfer it back to the seminary. It's about to be transferred back. I've been in communication with Evan Boyd, the head of the library, and with their new president, Guy Irwin. So it will not be on public display anymore because it's too fragile. But they have determined that they're going to make a replica robe. And so it's being soon fabricated at the textile fabricator there in Philadelphia. And so they will have a display case and this replica robe soon. So that's the update, Bill. I hope that's enough.
That's great. Thank you. And thank you for the work in getting that done. That's a great thing. So let's go on about Pete. Pete is an interesting guy. He did indeed recruit Virginia's 8th Regiment. He became a colonel. You became a colonel in the Continental Army by recruiting a regiment, of which you were the overseer. As I say, about 140 from Dunmore County, a number of other people from neighboring counties. They were sometimes called the German Regiment in Virginia. The Virginia's 8th Regiment was formed under Peter Muhlenberg. Their first action in the Revolutionary War was to be sent south to Charleston, where they saw some duty at Sullivan's Island. Many of us think of the Revolutionary War as a New England, Pennsylvania, Virginia kind of thing. But if you go down to the South, there were concerns among the colonists about the Spanish in addition to the British, because the Spanish down in Florida, the British were always worried about the Spanish coming up, and they built a lot of fortresses in Georgia and South Carolina to defend against the Spanish. And that was the first place that Muhlenberg's brigade was sent. They subsequently were called back, and they served with distinction at the battles of Brandywine and Germantown in Pennsylvania. I will say I grew up in Philadelphia, so I know all about the battles of Brandywine and Germantown. The Brandywine River is north of Newark, Delaware, just barely into Pennsylvania. It's one of George Washington's worst battles in the entire war. Washington thought he could stop the British advance toward Philadelphia at the Brandywine River. He had some bad intelligence, and the British crossed the river north of his position. He thought he had all the fording places covered. He didn't. They got around his right flank and routed the colonials rather badly. Peter Muhlenberg's units at that time served under General Nathaniel Greene, and they were assigned to cover the retreat of all the units that had been in the north. And so they were the last people out of Brandywine. And there is a second legend of General Pete that I really enjoy almost as much as the first, that at the Battle of Brandywine, some folks were told to shoot at the guy on the horse, which of course would have been him. But to his rescue was shouted out in German, "Hier ist Teufel Piet." It was his old buddies in the dragoons who were part of the Hessian mercenaries that were working with the British soldiers on the West Bank, and they didn't shoot at Peter Muhlenberg. You can decide whether or not you believe that story as well, but I think it makes for good legend also that his old friends who nicknamed him Teufel Piet recognized him on the battlefield. He did winter with George Washington at Valley Forge. He was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General in February of 1777, and he commanded the light infantry at Yorktown in the final battle of the Revolutionary War under the Marquis de Lafayette. He was retired at the end of the war as a major general. And then what do? You've got yourself here a college graduate who's out of work. What do college graduates who are out of work do? You move back in with mom and dad. And so Peter went off to live with Henry Melchior Muhlenberg near the congregation at Trapp in Pennsylvania. I'd love to say the story goes happily ever after. It was not such a happy time. Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, like many of the German Lutherans in Pennsylvania, was staunchly anti-slavery. And Pete had become Virginiafied. And Pete brought with him two individuals, at least two, that he enslaved. So bringing enslaved people to the house of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg probably led to some considerable tension in the family. When I did this presentation among the alumni at Muhlenberg, the fact that Pete owned slaves was, I think, the most dramatic thing to them. They had not realized that that was the case. And there is some scholarship on that that's done by the folks in the Historical Society in Trapp, Pennsylvania, that document the enslaved folks that came with Peter Muhlenberg. So the other thing you do if you're out of work is you run for political office. And Peter was elected to the first Congress in 1789. He was reelected. He took some time off in the election of 1800 that brought Thomas Jefferson to the presidency. He was elected to the Senate. His term would have begun in March. His term ended in March with his resignation. One account I read said that he served 2 days in the United States Senate, but he was given another job. He was assigned a federal position. His son, Francis Swain Muhlenberg, also became a U.S. representative from the state of Ohio. And one of the things I will be showing you a little later is just how many Muhlenbergs served in the Congress. So that's the end of my story of General Pete. But the story of the Muhlenberg family and its contribution to the founding of our nation, and indeed to the founding of the Lutheran Church in our nation, goes well beyond Pete. So let me start with the first generation. Henry Melchior Muhlenberg was sent to the colonies from the folks at Halle in Germany to pastor the Lutherans. An important thing is his marriage to Anna Maria Weiser. Important because it demonstrated to fellow people that he intended to stay. There had been other pastors who'd sort of been sent in who just looked around and went home. He demonstrated he was going to stay, and his slogan that he adopted, Ecclesia Plantanda, The church must be planted. Probably a slogan we can all appreciate even today. The church must be planted. And that was his motto throughout his ministry. And I'll stop here for a second and invite you to either unmute yourself and speak it, or to put in the chat, and Patty can monitor the chat. If you were about to send somebody to pastor all of the Lutherans in the colonies, what skills would you be looking for in that individual? Ideas?
Missionary minded.
Missionary minded?
A good speaker.
Good speaker, good preacher.
In good health.
Good health.
Able to relate to people.
Able to relate to people, good.
I would think he might need to be
Speaking of-
adaptable.
I'm sorry, I missed.
Adaptable, because the colonies were not Europe.
Sure.
Adaptable and also a risk taker.
Yeah.
Be able to organize people.
Yes.
Ride a horse.
Yep.
Fundraise.
Fundraise.
Right, there you go. That doesn't end.
Well, let me walk you through some of the skills that we know that Henry had. One of them was legal skills. He was able to read and interpret the laws of the various colonies, and he helped congregations establish legal standing within several of the colonies. The pastoral skills, the voyage over was treacherous. There are times that a lot of the people on board the ship didn't think they were going to make it. And there are reports that he did a fantastic job of ministering to the fellow passengers on that ship, and himself was a good pastor. The first place he wound up landing was not in Pennsylvania, but actually down in Charleston, and was dispatched into Georgia. One of the early colonies of Lutherans in North America was in Georgia. A group of Lutherans from Salzburg migrated. They were told in Salzburg that they were going to become Catholics or they had to leave town, and they left town and moved to Georgia. They were sent up the Savannah River and given some land where they were told it would be great land. They weren't even going to need to clear it. The reason they didn't need to clear it was because nothing grew there. But through hard work, they were able to develop some farming. New Jerusalem Church, I think, still exists. Jim, I'm going to look at you again. Did you visit Georgia?
Yeah, because I had my picture taken in their high pulpit in that church, so it's still there.
Yeah. But he was sent to Salzburg. He was later to visit the Salzburgers, who were having a bit of a kerfuffle over some of their pastors. Gee, that never happens. Must have been a unique experience. But Henry's trip there laid out rules for mediation and arbitration. It had been his experience in legal handling, in other things, that what passed for the way the courts worked is that lawyers from both sides extracted all the money they could from both sides and then reported a case for mediation. Henry was smart enough to bypass the lawyers, went straight to mediation, but set out rules within the congregation in Georgia for what they would need to do to accept him as a mediator. What I find fascinating, in my research, I found a dissertation for a law school that discovered that the current statutes in Georgia for how arbitration and mediation take place derive from Muhlenberg's rules on mediation. So among his skills, in addition to his pastoring and his legal things, were being a good mediator. Someone mentioned being an organizer. He established the first synod, got together the pastors of all the churches near Trapp in Pennsylvania, and developed a common liturgy and meetings from time to time that gathered people together. He was always nervous about the cause for independence. He encouraged his sons in education to become pastors, but through preaching, organizing, mediating, administration, legal work, he was multilingual. Someone mentioned adaptability. There's a story that he one Sunday preached in 3 different churches in 3 different languages.
Wow.
So we think that our pastors who have 3-point parishes today have it rough. Try doing your sermon in 3 different languages on a given Sunday. Add in. He was the perfect person to be what I will call the patriarch of the Lutheran Church in the United States. And patriarchy is not a real good word these days, but I mean patriarch in the most positive sense of the word. He's a person to be admired for what he did in putting together our church. And in fact, he planted the church in this country. So this is the 2nd generation of Muhlenbergs. We've gone through General Peaks, John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. There are 2 other sons that you will see here, Frederick Augustus Conrad Muhlenberg and Gotthilf Heinrich Ernst Muhlenberg, a number of daughters and 4 other children who didn't survive to adulthood. You will find, if you look up Muhlenbergs, that there's a zillion Frederick Augustus Muhlenbergs throughout the generations. And if somebody references Fred, you need to know which one it is, because there are a lot of them. Frederick Augustus Conrad Muhlenberg is the first of those, and he will be somebody I'll talk a little bit more about in a couple of minutes. Eve Elisabeth married Reverend Schulze, who worked for Pastor Muhlenberg for Henry. There are multiple spellings of Schultz, some with the SCHULTZ, some with the SCHULZE. There are Schultzes still in the Shenandoah Valley that may trace their lineage back to Eve Elisabeth Muhlenberg. Their son, John Andrew Schulze, was twice elected governor of Pennsylvania. Not only did Henry Melchior Muhlenberg father a lot of children, but Eve and Pastor Schultz had 9 children of their own. So there got to be one way to keep up the membership in your congregation. Frederick Augustus Conrad Muhlenberg, the next son, also a reluctant colonial, was assigned a parish in New York. He became pastor of a church. He became a real colonial when the British burned his church down. And he too, out of work, college graduate, moved back in with Dad. But he gave up pastoring in 1779 and joined the Continental Congress and became the government in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. He was elected to the General Assembly. He was the Speaker of the Pennsylvania General Assembly. He was the first judge, recorder of deeds, register of wills. There was no courthouse. His house became the seat of county government. He was the president of the Constitutional Convention for Pennsylvania. He was elected to the very first U.S. Congress, began in 1789, and was the first Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. Now in Virginia, we learned that the first executive officer of the United States was George Washington. If you grew up in Pennsylvania and you know that the Congress was all seated before the president, you will know that the first real executive of the United States was Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, because he was in charge even before George as Speaker of the House. Further bit of trivia. There is a bit of legend that goes with Frederick Augustus, and it is that he supposedly cast the deciding vote against making German an official language of the United States. That there was a move early on, certainly among many of the colonials, that German along with English would be official languages. English was never declared an official language, so his rationale was that German shouldn't be an official language either, but there had been a movement to make German an official language of the United States, and despite his German heritage, he opposed that move. The Speaker's house, this was the House of County Government, still stands at 151 West Main Street in Trapp, and the Historical Society has taken very good care of it. Part of what got me interested in the Muhlenbergs is that there's a piece of property that adjoins the Speaker's house, that adjoined a piece of property that may have been part of my family and was sold together. Some of my ancestors were named McGargle, and the McGargles and the Muhlenbergs, I don't know which McGargles and which Muhlenbergs, but they sold this piece of property together. Next brother, Gotthilf Heinrich Ernst Muhlenberg. Pastor like his brothers, pastor like his father, educated at Halle. This Muhlenberg, along with Fred and Pete, were sent together. But he also was a fallen away pastor and made his career primarily as a botanist. In fact, he's probably the premier botanist of his era. There's a genus of grasses named in his honor. He produced an incredible catalog of specimens of plants in the colonies, which became I hate to call it the botanist Bible, but it was the botanist core work in its time. He became a professor, and Gotthilf Muhlenberg was the first president of Franklin College, which is now Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So his real contribution was not military, but education. Subsequent generations from him, his sons include Augustus Hall Muhlenberg, and grandson, another Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, who was the first president of Muhlenberg College. And after he retired at Muhlenberg College, was actually taken in by another of our Lutheran colleges at Thiel College out toward Pittsburgh, and was president of Thiel College. The Muhlenbergs formed quite a congressional dynasty. There are 6 Muhlenbergs who served in the United States House of Representatives. The most recent being another Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, who was in the United States Congress during the lifetime of some of us. This Frederick Augustus just passed away in 1980. So he was a 20th century congressperson. Peter Muhlenberg's daughter, Hester, married a man named Heister. It should be prohibited to become Hester Heister, but that's what she became. And Hester Heister brings in another group of people who served in the US Congress. There are 7 members of the Heister family that are married in with the Muhlenberg family, that by my count make 13 members of this family have served in the United States Congress. So when we think about the US Congress and some of the political families that have dominated American politics, there are the Rockefellers, the Kennedys, most recently the Bushes, the Roosevelts. There's a number of families that have really been dominant in United States politics. I'm not sure that there's another family that can claim 13 members of the US Congress like the Muhlenberg family can. It's an impressive number. So this family created a church, they created a political dynasty, and they made great contributions in the area of education. And I've sort of hinted at some of those as I've gone through here. Muhlenberg College is named for Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. Its first president, Frederick Augustus. Gotthilf Heinrich Ernst was president at Franklin and Marshall. Thiel College also. St. Paul's College in Flushing, Long Island was founded by William Augustus Muhlenberg. And Muhlenbergs have served on faculty. When I was a student at Muhlenberg College in the 1970s, there was a professor of economics, Henry Melchior Muhlenberg Richards was I believe the chair of the Department of Economics at the time. And so there's quite a tradition within the family in academics, as well as in politics, in military history. And if we had infinite time, I would go on and tell you that there is a Muhlenberg who was a famous stuntman actor. There is a Muhlenberg architectural firm that is prominent in the Philadelphia area that has several members of the family that have gone on. This is a family that is very important in the history, certainly in the founding of our nation. So I'm an academic, which means that I have to pay my academic debts. And much of what I have reported to you this evening comes from research I did in looking at some places. The articles in the Journal of the American Revolution talk about the farewell sermon from General Pete. The story of slavery, I'll get to in a second. Henry Augustus' Life of Major General Pete is the first place that the saga of the legend is reported. The thesis that I mentioned is from E.R. Lanier. There are other biographies of Muhlenbergs that I'll call to your attention. If you're interested also, there's some interesting web references. You can find some of the family lineage just by going to Wikipedia. It's not my favorite source, but it's a good, quick, and easy place to look things up. The slavery thing comes from the Trapp Historical Society. Good things on the Battle of Brandywine, the Battle of Germantown. The Battle of Germantown, Peter Muhlenberg did not distinguish himself there. He got his troops too far ahead of his supply lines and his supporting things and needed to sort of be rescued. He made good progress and got way too far in advance, but he was a part of the Battle of Germantown as well as the Battle of Brandywine in Pennsylvania. So I'm going to stop the screen share here, and I will invite you to offer up any thoughts you might have, questions you might have. I'll try to answer. What I don't know the answer to, I will point to others if that's available. If you feel more comfortable raising your question in the chat, you are welcome to do that.
A lot of my family is from Muhlenberg County, Kentucky.
Okay.
And I don't know any of the history of Muhlenberg County, Kentucky, and this is making me wonder. So now I have a job to do to research that. That's
Yes.
the family.
The patterns of migration of German Lutherans, many came to the Philadelphia area and
That's
moved into Western, what would have then been Western Pennsylvania, the Lancaster area.
Mhm.
And they came down the Shenandoah Valley and might have populated Muhlenberg County, Kentucky from that migration.
It was part of the land tract that was granted to soldiers after the Revolutionary
Okay.
War. So I'm sure it has something to do with that. Now I've got to find out after this. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. There's another group of colonial era Lutherans in central New York that were sort of pushed out by the British and wound up heading down. They made very good friends with the indigenous people in central New York, who taught them the back way down to Lancaster to meet up with their fellow countrymen, so that they didn't have to go through New York and Philadelphia and places that would have been under British occupancy. And they came down the back roads, if you will, through central New York and central Pennsylvania, and again into the Shenandoah Valley.
Margaret has her hand up.
Margaret?
Well, I have my little smartphone here, so I looked up Muhlenberg County, Kentucky, and it said that it's named after General Peter Muhlenberg, who was the colonial general during the American Revolutionary War.
Okay,
There's the answer. Thank you.
there it is.
And well, I know my grandmother was descendant of Palatine Germans that came in through Pennsylvania and ended up in Hopkins, Kentucky.
Hmm.
But they were from Wittenberg, actually.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Palatines. That's not a relation to Muhlenberg.
No, they were Lutherans, and
Okay.
they had to flee. I don't know all the history again. I need to learn more about this, but that's so interesting about Muhlenberg, Kentucky.
Okay.
And I was born near there, and I didn't know this.
Well, I know very little about Fredericksburg other than what we learned the first 2 weeks we were here.
Yeah.
You need to take
Well, maybe,
the
yeah.
trolley ride.
Maybe that,
Yep, that's it. That's what we did.
At the trolley ride.
I happen to know a good
Maybe
guide on the
the,
trolley ride.
Hey, Margaret, do you know
what is
that
his
I
name?
drive the trolleys? Margaret,
Oh,
come
you
visit
do?
me on the trolley.
Okay,
Oh.
I'll remember that.
Oh, we have to do that. We'll have to get together and do it.
Okay, Palatines.
Going back to the very front where the date that's given is January 21st was supposedly was when he did that.
Yes.
Is there any reason that that date is kind of held up as the time of the sermon?
It's the date that his nephew used in the first account. If you want my opinion, and I would say it's an educated opinion, but I am not a professional historian. My guess is that whatever he preached in March of that year. That he'd already been commissioned by the House of Burgesses in Virginia in January to recruit. And my guess is that he had recruited not only in Dunmore County, but in neighboring counties, and might have even assembled all of that regiment in Woodstock that day as he was leaving. The records in Beckford Parish and the Episcopal Church don't have him doing any pastoral duties after March of '76. And late March, early April, the date escapes me, is when he's formally commissioned colonel of the regiment in front of all of his men at Williamsburg. So they would have picked up and marched, give him some time to get there. So I'm guessing that whatever transpired in March. The fact that there was a farewell sermon, I'm game. I think it probably happened. Did it happen exactly the way his nephew does reports? Who knows?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
One of the interesting aspects to legends is to ask the question, why? Why is the story told if it's probably not true? And one article I read suggested that in the 1840s and 1850s, German immigrants were not highly regarded in the United States, and that the story was told to demonstrate the importance and just how American the German immigrants were. That they were an important piece of the American Revolution, and it was a way to Americanize the German immigrants at the time and reinforce their standing in the US. I saw that account one place. I like to see accounts multiple places if I'm going to believe them.
Well, my dad was a German immigrant, so it's very interesting.
Jim?
I was going to say that along with your reasoning, Muhlenberg Lutheran in Harrisonburg was founded about the same time. I think the same reasoning. They named it Muhlenberg, and Muhlenberg himself had nothing to do with that congregation, but just, to remember the patriotism of the Germans.
Mm-hmm. There's a story I've heard told also that has to do with American flags in Lutheran sanctuaries, that they were put there during the First World War to demonstrate that the German Lutherans were indeed Americans. And that's how flags first got into churches. I don't know if that story is true or not, but I have heard that account, and it's not the only time that Germans have had to be real Americans.
Hey, Bill.
Yeah.
They had trouble raising funds for the 200th anniversary and a little bit later because the fundraising went on up until World War I. And you can imagine that raising money for something connected to Germans was not popular.
Yeah.
My grandfather was a pastor in Pennsylvania when my father was born, 1917. And my grandparents named him Carl with a K. And the church council upbraided my grandparents for naming my father a German name like that.
Wow. councils really do get involved in places they don't necessarily belong, right?
Right. My Aunt Jean says hello to you too, okay?
Yeah,
I
good,
communicate with her today, so.
good.
My Uncle Carl was pastor there, you know, your church,
My-
is your
my
mom
mom's
still doing
church.
okay? She's,
Yeah, my mom's good. Little tired of being by herself, but you know.
I think it's time to stop the record.
All right.